Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. We are so glad you could join us today. My name is Amber Robinson, and as a volunteer with the Society of Wetland Scientists Webinar Planning Committee, a certified professional wetland scientist, and a native to coastal Louisiana, I am so pleased to be the moderator for today's very special webinar about Louisiana's coastal wetlands. We're excited to share this SWS e-learning experience today for all of us to engage virtually and earn continuing education credits. Today's topic, Coastal 101. It will be presented today by Isabella Donnell, who works for the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, a nonprofit who's been doing some incredible coastal restoration and advocacy work to help combat the coastal land loss we face in Louisiana. Isabella grew up in Daphne, Alabama, and moved to New Orleans to attend college in 2015. In 2020, Isabella received her master's degree in ecology and evolutionary biology from Tulane University. Her studies focused on plant ecology and marsh ecosystems. She began working at Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana in 2020, and over the past 5 years has worked in operations and outreach with the organization. I'm so pleased to welcome Isabella. Thanks for taking the time to present on this topic today.
Of
Isabella?
course. Thank you so much, Amber, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and to speak to you today about CRCL. And we're going to cover a little bit about the history of the Mississippi River, how coastal Louisiana as a landmass came to be. We'll talk about the land loss crisis that we're currently facing, contributing factors that are causing that land loss. Then we'll get into the history of CRCL, our advocacy, and our current program. So basically what we're doing trying to address the land loss crisis. And so with that, Madison, can I have help advancing to the next slide? Thank you. So here we'll start off talking about the Mississippi River Drainage Basin. It covers 41% of the contiguous United States, as you can see in the image, and is a massive drainage basin. And you can see it also touches 2 Canadian provinces, and all of that water flows from the whole of the basin down to the river where it goes through New Orleans and then flows through our estuaries and then out into the Gulf. And so we'd like to talk a little bit about the kind of historic process of how that land got built. Madison, could I have next? And so here you can kind of see a river is always going to take the shortest path that it can to get to the outflow area. And what's so unique about our landmass here is that it was built over time as the river changed course. And so what has been historically called these different bodies of land that it's built are the lobes. And in this image, you can see how each lobe has built over time and the correlated, like how many years ago that happened. So it started further to the west and then over time kind of swung very far to the east and then has settled onto number 6, which is what is called the Mississippi's Birdfoot Delta. And it's called Birdfoot because it's got 3 kind of main prongs that kind of looks like a bird's foot. And so here, oh, a little fast. Here's an image that exemplifies what the coastline kind of looked like before the river had come down to meet the Gulf. And then we'll watch a time lapse as it continues to change over the years. Then you can see it starting to move west and kind of the sediment outfall area that's happening as it slowly builds towards the coastline that we are familiar with today. So if the river has spent thousands of years building the coast, why would we now be facing a land loss crisis? And the answer to that is in large part due to continued settlement along the river. You know, New Orleans became developed, and with that development came the needs to protect people and their property and their crops. And so for a long while, every spring, the river would overtop its banks and deposit sediment, and people kind of lived with the natural flow. But as it became more developed, there became resistance to this natural process in the interest of protecting, again, people, property, and crops. And this all came to a head during the Great Flood of 1927. The flood displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and took anywhere between 250 and 500 lives. It's considered one of the greatest natural disasters in US history. And so in response to this, the federal government said we need a way to protect the people along the river so that this type of disaster can't happen again. And they commissioned the federal levee system. And you can see in this image, highlighted in red, is what was then built over the next approximately 10 years. So the red, if you can see my cursor here, hugs the Atchafalaya, and you can see that it's more of a flood plain, whereas along the Mississippi River, it's hugged the banks of the river incredibly closely and follows all the way down. However, that's just at the federal level. Many parishes, regions, and even cities also found need as time went on to better protect themselves from floodwaters and have developed smaller levee systems as well, which we can see in this next image is an example of the ring levee system that goes from La Rose, Louisiana down to Golden Meadow, Louisiana. And you might wonder why it might be an enclosed circle. And this is because a lot of communities, especially further down south in the estuary region, suffer not only from flooding when there's rainfall and the water's moving across the landscape from north to south, but also when there's storm surge and you have high winds pushing water up into the estuaries, and you get this kind of double effect. And so the goal of the ring levee system is that they can close these gates when we know that there's a storm with a high storm surge coming, so to protect themselves from that swell of water. So historically, before we had the levees, sediment deposition was everywhere, and it built this incredible process over thousands of years where we were able to have the shape of the coast that we know today. But with the expanse of building levees, we've lost that process. And so this image was taken in 2011 when the Bonnie Carey Spillway was opened, which is a flood control structure that can, if the river looks like it's going to reach a peak height or be in danger of overtopping the levees, they open the Bonnie Carey Spillway, which opens into Lake Pontchartrain, which is this body of water right here. And you can see, as a cause of the river levees, most of the sediment plumes, which are circled in red, are not going into estuaries the same way that they would have historically. They're going out into these deeper bodies of water where they get carried away by currents. And the Bonnie Carey Spillway, when it was built, was thought it was going to be more of an emergency structure and very, very seldom used. However, over time, it has become used more frequently. Between 2010 and 2020, it was opened 6 times. And that's more than half of the total amount of times it's ever been used since its construction. So its use is becoming more frequent as well. Other changes that are contributing to our land loss crisis are sea level rise, the continued constructions of dams that block flow of sediment, invasive species that harm and eat our wetlands, subsidence, which is a naturally occurring process given the nature of how the land was built, because the sediment is so soft in a way that it's meant to subside over time. It just changes. The topography is very dynamic, which is why it was so important that it got replenished annually. And without that replenishment, you start to have the sinking. Oil and gas infrastructure, our marshes are famously rich for that and have been explored a great deal. Navigation channels for shipping and industry, and oil spills and hurricanes all interact to exacerbate the rate of the land loss that we face. So to get into it a little bit more, what's also unique about Louisiana is because have the subsidence, and our land is compacting on itself and sinking over time, we have the highest relative rate of sea level rise in the world because at the same time that our oceans are rising, our delta is sinking. And then we also have subsidence, which again is a natural part of the cycle where if you think back to the image of the lobes, typically sediment would be deposited and then the river migrates and then it moves kind of back on top of itself. So it was really a regenerative and replenishing process. But when you levee the river, that process can no longer happen. And what happens instead is that land kind of sinks and slowly erodes. And then oils and gas canals. And before it was oil and gas, it was logging. Very rich cypress swamps many years ago, and industry came in to be able to log and make a profit. And anytime you cut a canal through a healthy marsh, you expose a greater amount of surface area, and that allows greater level of erosion and wave action against that exposed marsh edge, so it eats away faster. The other problem with canals is that it allows for saltwater intrusion. There's an incredible gradient of marshes and estuaries from like roughly around where Lake Pontchartrain would be, and you begin to have some freshwater ones all the way down to the mouth of the Gulf where it would be heavier saline, not quite salt waters or like ocean levels of salt water, but much heavier saline than freshwater. And we'll look at some of those gradients. But when you cut a canal, you're also creating a rapid inlet for that salt water to creep up higher into what would be brackish or freshwater estuaries. And because the sensitivity of the species, you very quickly get a change in the vegetation, which brings us to vegetation dieback. And so when you get that saltwater intrusion, you get vegetation dieback and kind of a turnover in what type of ecosystem you have. And with the turnover, you often lose biomass because it cannot reestablish itself at the rate at which it's being affected. Another major factor is hurricanes, and so this is a before and after of Hurricane Katrina satellite imagery, and you can see in the lower part of the image kind of just the intense difference in the health of the marshes, and a large part of this was due to saltwater intrusion that was caused by the Mr. Go Canal, which is what the yellow arrow is pointing to, and it's this massive, long, straight canal because it was dug because ships wanted a more efficient route to get from the Gulf and to the port of the city. Following the storm, it was an advocacy group called the Mr. Go Must Go coalition formed to advocate for getting it blocked off so that it could not incur that type of storm surge were another hurricane of that magnitude to come. And they were successful. And so Mr. Go has been closed off with like a rock barrier since then. Another cause of land loss is invasive species. We have pictured in the top left the rosocane mealybug. Rosocane is a native marsh grass, and the mealybug is an insect that comes and eats it in droves. Wild boar are a nuisance and a problem in our marshes and for many farmers in the south, but specifically in the marshes, they eat away at the wetlands. And nutria similarly love juvenile trees and will just gnaw away at our establishing vegetation in the estuaries. And so all of these changes cumulatively together, you can kind of see pictured. This is just from 1932 to 2010, but the image represents a total of 2,000 miles of land lost. And that's all estuaries. And so here's another image that kind of depicts the gradients that you have from freshwater to saltwater. And this was taken in 2013. And you can kind of see the parallels between this map where you're seeing that land loss, which would inevitably accelerate saltwater intrusion, to 3 years later, this map being generated and showing kind of the brim of what has now become saline marsh. And the result of all of that are these changes in our estuaries, because we have all of these species that are very sensitive. And what compounds from there then too is because this is a working coast and it's home to so many people and so many people who work the estuaries, is that where people can make their livelihood also shifts. If the shrimp cannot survive in the estuary because the estuaries become too saline, then the shrimpers have to watch for those changes and watch for the migrations of the species. And so here is another kind of set of aerial images to illustrate this point of what happens with erosion as canals continue to be dug over the course of many decades. And you can see we went from like a very small encapsulated lake with healthy marshes and a handful of canals to what is essentially an entirely open body of water. And so, what we try to talk about often with the public in terms of education and outreach when people say, okay, we're facing this massive land loss crisis. You might have heard the statistic of every 100 minutes we lose a football field of land, and that is an average. But so, what do we do about it? And something that Louisiana is trying to champion for is this theory of multiple lines of defense, which our best natural defense is a healthy ecosystem, healthy marsh, and that's your first line of defense. Your second line of defense would be structural adaptations. So things like green infrastructure, but also elevating your homes so that in case of storm surge or flood, they're not immediately being flooded. And then the last are more behavioral. So having city plans for evacuation mandates, should that be needed, or making sure that evacuation routes are known by citizens, having engaged city planning so that residents know how best to prepare for a storm and what types of things they might need to be storm aware. And then in addition to, or I guess to highlight the types of environmental things that can, then type of environmental projects that would underscore the multiple lines of defense. Those are things like vegetative plantings, barrier island restoration, hydrologic restoration, shoreline protection, marsh creation, and terracing. And all of these types of projects are things that the CPRA and QIPRA both work on, which are two different agencies that we'll speak a little bit more on in a moment. CRCL really leans into vegetative planting and shoreline protection. Those are where our two main programmatic restoration areas are, which we'll also talk about more in a short while. And so here's another map that shows projected land loss. So this map highlights if we were to take no action, no restoration initiatives, no policy initiatives to protect our marshes, and sea level rise continues, as well as global warming for the next 50 years, here's the projected loss. And then here is a map put that shows what happens with action. So what happens if we can enact our coastal master plan? What happens if we do pass policy suggested and have these different types of restoration projects working in tandem together? And of course, there's still land loss because it's a dynamic ecosystem and we're not trying to repair the coast exactly to what it was 50 years ago. That's just not feasible anymore. But the goal is that you can see in this map, there is land gained. There's still opportunity to restore certain aspects of the coast and build land in certain regions. And so this takes us into who is CRCL. So we were founded in 1988 and we were the state's first nonprofit dedicated to land loss crisis in Louisiana and specifically focusing on advocating for coastal Louisiana. So our mission is to unite people in action to achieve a thriving, sustainable Louisiana coast for all. And our vision is vibrant wetlands with hurricane protection, bountiful ecosystems, and economic opportunities all across Louisiana's coast. And delving deeper into our advocacy, very broadly, what CRCL supports is sound decision making, utilizing natural systems, coastal conservation, providing a thriving coast for all, and long-term visioning. So whenever we are doing outreach or trying to help educate legislators or pushing for public policy to be amended, this is where we are grounding ourselves as we move through those. And to delve a little bit more into our specific advocacy priorities, on the federal level, we support QIPRA, which is a federal agency that plans projects. We support beneficial use of dredged sediment, and we support the U.S. Army Corps' studies and funding of their studies. At the state level, we support coastal funding, upriver diversions, the master planning process, and do no harm wetlands mitigation, and we'll touch on these more specifically here. And so QIPRA was created in 1990 to fund the design and construction of coastal wetlands and restorations projects. They're specifically focusing on projects with an impact region of less than 500 square miles, and they're regionally focused. And so when CRCL says that we advocate for QIPRA, it's like advocating to ensure that they have funds to be able to do the design and construction of coastal wetlands restoration projects. Beneficial use, so we advocate for the beneficial use of dredged material. There's a federal rule that whenever you're building out a project and contracting out that work, you need to take the most affordable contract. And so right now, what that means in terms of use of sediment is that most often it is just dumped into deeper waters rather than being recycled into a restoration project. And so CRCL is advocating for any dredged material to be kind of matched to a restoration project so that it can help build land. And then the Army Corps of Engineers studies, we support the funding of their different studies. One that was supposed to be occurring currently was the Lower Mississippi River Comprehensive Management Study, which would have been a 5-year, $25 million kind of mega study that covered the hydrology of the river that's highlighted in red here on this map. However, due to presidential budget changes, the funds were cut and the study has been put on pause. A lot of planning had happened, but they weren't able to push forward on the research. And then coastal funding at the state level typically means advocating and helping legislators understand the importance of passing the CPRA annual budget. So the CPRA has to get its budget approved every year. The 2026 fiscal plan was approved for almost $2 billion, which is awesome. And then the state also has a coastal trust fund, which is unique to Louisiana. We have this pot of money that's specifically dedicated to restoration and must be spent on projects that are outlined within the coastal master plan. We also support upriver diversions, which aim to reconnect the river in the historic way that it had interacted with our marshlands. And there's two types of diversions. There's the sediment diversions and the freshwater diversions. The map here kind of enumerates a couple that already exist and are planned. So we have the Davis Pond and Carnarvon freshwater diversions, which would be example of more up. And then you have the Mid-Breton sediment diversion, which is not constructed yet, but has plans. And then the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion, which was officially suspended in July of 2025. They're starting to explore some alternate, smaller, potentially freshwater diversions that are nearby. And so CRCL is watching closely to hear if and when there's more movement on that. And then the master plan process, which is done in large part by the CPRA. So we support and advocate for the master plan process. And the 2023 plan had 73 projects outlined, and it's a kind of a comprehensive coast-wide project planning initiative of if we want what areas of the coast are in being most impacted and what types of projects could we create that would work synergistically across the different parishes and across the region to reduce flood risk and build and maintain land. CPRA is currently beginning its planning phase for its next master plan because we put one out every 6 years, and they have just finished up a series of community meetings where they will go into the towns and neighborhoods along coastal Louisiana and invite feedback and thoughts from different community members and residents in the area and ask what they would want to see happen in terms of restoration of their neighborhoods and regions. And then wetlands mitigation. So the wetlands mitigation is controlled by Louisiana's Department of Energy and Natural Resources Office of Coastal Management. Mitigation means the replacement or substitution or enhancement or protection of ecological value, offsetting any types of planned projects that would cause harm to the marshes or wetlands in a specific area. So CRCL is advocating for like higher levels of wetlands mitigation whenever a project is being implemented where we know that it would be damaging the marshes, and that's already accounted for. We want to see actionable plans on how they would plan to then fund or create a not exactly a replacement, but a replacement of some level to offset the damages. And this takes us into CRCL's programming after an overview of our advocacy. And so we have our two main restoration programs, our native plant program and our oyster shell reefs and our oyster shell recycling program. And so with our native plants program, we bring volunteers out into our marshes and swamps, and we do marsh grass plantings, coastal forest restoration, and dune grass plantings. And here you can see a map of all of our plantings to date. We have officially, map is maybe just 2 years old, so there's a few more that are on here, but we have officially planted more than 1 million trees, which we're very happy to say. You can see the different types of plantings as they fall out across the coast. And then we also do monitoring work of our plantings. This is an example of a dune grass planting over at Grand Terre 1 year later. So we'll take monitoring of we'll tag roughly 10% of the trees that we plant and then monitor for the following 3 to 5 years to check in on the survivability. Has the salinity changed? Is that affecting the survivability? To kind of get an idea of if we would need to return to that site or if to either help bolster the initial effort or if it was a really successful event, and then we can encourage maybe a different kind of planting to have some co-species. And then we also have our oyster shell recycling program where we build living shorelines using recycled oyster shells. So to do this, we partner with a swath of local restaurants in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and we collect their oyster shell in these special recycling bins that are picked up by our contractor and then taken down to our shell pile in Violet, Louisiana. The shell sits and cures at our site for about 6 months, where it's then bagged by volunteers. And you can see in the left image, volunteers bagging the shell at our HQ site, our headquarters site. And then it's taken out into the marsh to build a living shoreline, again with the help of volunteers. And we've had different partners over the years. We'd like to try and get community input. In the fall, we're planning to build a reef with Lumcon as our partner. Last year, it was the Pointe tribe. And we take counsel from our partners as to where they would like to see the reef placed to best mitigate erosion. And so here's an example of one of the reefs we did with Point Auchan, which was built to protect some nearby mounds that they were noticing beginning to erode, which is part of the reason why the reef is so much higher than the water level and so close to the shoreline. And you can typically also see in an image how the shoreline acts as a rock wall and will slow wave energy as the water hits the shell. And then here are all of our reefs to date. Leeville was our most recent. We did in February. And then here are all of the others from years prior. There's the Point Auchan Community Reef.
Hey, Isabella, sorry to
Yeah.
jump in, but was the Leeville uh, in conjunction with um, the Super Bowl, or am I
Yes.
misremembering that? Yeah.
No, yeah. So there was a philanthropic arm of the Super Bowl committee. I think it's Force Blue. And they reached out to us wanting to partner and sponsor a restoration event. So that one was a slightly smaller scale because typically our reef build events are 8 days spread across 2 weeks, and this was going to be a single day event. So we got permitted, I think, close to 200 feet of reef to be built. And we built out in one day about 50 feet with volunteer help and did a marsh grass planting in conjunction with that. And so we have plans in the works, not for this fall, but in further afield years to return to that site since we already have it permitted and expand the reef. Thank you, Amber. And then other programmatic work that we do includes our Coastal Leadership Institute, which is a leadership program run by our advocacy and outreach department geared towards mid-career level individuals, focusing on ecology, culture, politics, and economy of the coast. And we try to get people who are interested in learning more, not necessarily already coastal experts, but people who want to become well-versed in being able to advocate for the coast. Last year was our pilot program, and we accepted about 25 individuals, and for the fall, we'll be running a cohort of 30 individuals. We also have our Future Coastal Leaders program, which is geared towards college students and trying to get students from universities all across coastal Louisiana to build more camaraderie and understanding that it's really a statewide problem and not just like a regional or parish specific problem. And we bring students out for experiential learning along the coast. And this is also really cool because you watch students connect with like-minded individuals sometimes, or sometimes students who've lived in the area for a while but haven't had the chance to go out as much and really understand how close their city is to this wilderness of marshes and wetlands. And sometimes you have students change majors, which is also really fun to see because they're exploring their paths further, and we want to have as many people as cross as many majors as possible involved in this type of work. We also put on every 2 years our State of the Coast Conference, which I would think would probably be the program most of interest to attendees today. We just had our 2025 conference in late May. And so our next conference will be in 2027, likely late May again, but we bring together experts across many disciplines like humanities and engineering and current scientific research to discuss all things coastal Louisiana, and what is the forefront of the science and what is the forefront of the policy that's happening. Very fun. It's probably one of the biggest and coolest things I think that we do.
And people come from all over the world, right? It's not just a Louisiana.
Yeah, it's Louisiana focused, but we get international attendees. Additional ways to get involved. We always welcome people to come volunteer with us. We welcome people to donate to us, to vote pro-coastal is what we like to say, or vote for the coast if ever there's policy or legislation that's coming out that's can affect coastal restoration. We encourage people to vote to pass it. And you can also follow us on social media at CRCL 1988 is our URL across all social platforms. And that takes me to the end of our slides.
Man, thanks so much. I know we're ending a little earlier than we normally do, but that leaves a lot of time for discussion, which I'm excited about. The work that you guys do is so incredible. And I'm so proud to know that we have organizations like CRCL helping with such, a huge problem we have in Louisiana. And I think that other states in coastal zones are recognizing the way that Louisiana set up its infrastructure to deal with these problems because, these problems translate, right, in other parts of the country and even in the world. And I think it's so important that we're leading in the advocacy through nonprofits like yourself and the state legislation and state agencies that have been set up in Louisiana. We really have been at the forefront, I think, of this work. So thank you for sharing. I am going to moderate the questions, you guys, like we normally do. So if you would, when you send questions, please use that Q&A chat box, not the regular chat box, to enter your questions. That'll make things easier for me to filter through them. Um, and also, if we run out of time, you're welcome to email the presenter um, to ask questions directly to her. So we'll get started though. So it looks like we have a question from Chuck Walker. Thanks, Chuck. So Isabella, how applicable are your programs to other locations?
Ooh, great question, Chuck. So I would say that probably our oyster shell recycling program is the one that jumps to me first because that is kind of geography specific, but ours was modeled off of some that already exist in the Northeast. I think Chesapeake Bay Foundation has one. CRCL is also a member of Restore America's Estuaries, which is like a national environmental nonprofit collaborative group. So there's a lot of shared learning that goes on there. And then interestingly, about a year ago, we had some individuals from Mississippi reach out to us asking how we run our oyster shell recycling program
Mm.
because there was some interest in trying to replicate that program there. The tree plantings, I have to say, I think are very, very replicable. I think a lot of restoration environmental nonprofits have their own flavor of our tree planting program. Yeah.
Great question. Thanks, Chuck. Next question comes from Gabrielle. Has CRCL looked into potential invasive species eradication?
Somewhat. We have done things when we are doing a planting to encourage volunteers to do invasive species removal while we're doing the planting, but we don't have an invasive species removal program that goes a little bit further away from what our main mission is as a nonprofit. But there are a good handful of local nonprofits who have recurring invasive species removal volunteer events. One that's like very, very local that I can name off the top of my head is Friends of Bayou St. John, which really tries to steward Bayou St. John, which is just a bayou in the neighborhood of New Orleans. And I think a few times a year they'll host like a water hyacinth removal
Mm.
cleanup, and volunteers will go down. We did have one event that was with our Future Coastal Leaders program that was entirely dedicated to invasive species removal. Most of our programs are also grant funded though. And so because our programs are kind of built more around the plantings and restoration of it, it's hard sometimes to get funding that's only explicitly for the invasive species. So I would say it's a component, but not its own program. And it is something that we pay attention to. And most of our staff could like point and identify like three major invasive plants or animals.
What are three, just for the folks to know?
Apple snails, super common, really gross looking. They lay these like bubble gum pink, styrofoamy, very textured egg clusters, and all you have to do to kill the egg clusters is submerge it in water. Water hyacinth, beautiful, was actually brought to Louisiana as part of the World's Fair at the turn
Hmm.
of the century, from abroad because the bloom is gorgeous, but it
Mhm.
clogs waterways. Um, and then mealybugs are also pretty easy to spot, but harder to do something about actively. And then Chinese tallow
Mhm.
is an invasive tree. It has these like white, kind of like popcorny looking, they're not flowers, but growths amongst the leaves that make them pretty identifiable, and it has a pretty identifiable shape. So if we're doing a swamp planting and we see those, we'll try and cut them down or pull them out.
Yeah, I know where I'm from, Japanese and Chinese privet. And this is, I'm in Lafayette, so I'm a little bit further north of the coast now, but along freshwater water bodies, we have issues with that plant for sure. Um, Next question. Samsung asks, can I compare a degradation of wetland in Louisiana with the wetland degradation in the Gangatic Plain in India? It's a tough one.
I am not versed enough in the Gangatic plain in India to be able to make an educated comparison, but I can say in a lot of the seminars and symposiums that I visit, and one that I went to last year, what I hear our delta compared to most often is the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, because I
Mm.
think it has the same system of a massive river that goes out into a massive drainage floodplain and historically has kind of like deposited sediment, but because of infrastructure being built, has kind of been like funneled down more narrowly over time.
All right, Lewis Mantini asks, do you have successful spat settling on your recycled oyster shells? I was actually thinking about that earlier, so great question, Lewis.
We do. We
Nice.
do monitoring also on our reefs for I think the 2 to 3 years following. And the degree of success depends a little bit on location, um, and like the salinity gradient, which also changes a little bit year to year. But on all of our reefs, there's been some level of recruitment.
Great. My friend Ricky Wilson asks, how do you identify sites for planting? And I'll add to that question because I know a little bit about um, how you guys get the plants. Can you tell folks um, how you're growing plants these days, like where you're actually getting the plants from? So, how do you
Yeah.
identify the sites and then where do the plants come from?
How to identify the sites? So we don't do research at our nonprofit. So that is the importance of our partnership with like other nonprofits that are either more science-based or supporting these plans, like the Coastal Master Plan that's developed by the CPRA that is absolutely rooted in like modeling and science. So we typically will look at either projects that are proposed and ways that we could add onto it, or we'll talk to community and kind of hear what the need is locally and then go from there to build out relationships and get permits. Because the other piece for us that is not an obstacle, but an important consideration is getting permits. So if
Mhm.
there's not a relationship with the landowner or the land owning entity, we're not able to do work there. So it's a little bit of a sweet spot between like, is this site in need of and ripe for restoration? And can we get the connections to be approved to do the restoration projects in this space? A cool one that we did recently was CPRA had constructed some terraces, which is that like
Mhm.
V kind of staggered shape in an eroding marshland to try and get land back in there. And they had wanted to do vegetative planting on top of the terraces to help them become more established, but ran out of funding. So we were able to partner with them. They had already like put the dredged material down and there was some growth, but we were able to take out volunteers and do a planting and put more vegetation down to stabilize it. And then in terms of where we get our plants, for many years we would purchase them through local, like native plant nurseries, and we still do that for our marsh grasses. In the past 3 to 4 years, we have really built out at the same, our restoration headquarters is what we call it, which is where the shell gets taken from the restaurants to cure. We now have a nursery. So we have a cypress seed drive where we encourage people in the greater New Orleans area and coastal Louisiana, but mostly the greater New Orleans area because of where the site is, to bring us or mail us cypress seeds that they collect in their yard, because we all know that a seed that's heirloom and already accustomed ecologically to the space is going to have better survivability. So we've been growing out cypress from seeds for a few years now, but we also buy in bulk bare root cypress and bare root tupelo, and then with the help of volunteers, we put them in pots, and then these kind of like, they're not all the time inundated, but these ponds that kind of drain, kind of fill to mimic like swamp water flow.
Mhm. Awesome. Thanks for that response. Next up, Chuck Walker has another question for you. Could other discarded construction materials be utilized? For example, demolished brick or concrete?
I'm assuming this is in reference to oyster reefs, and absolutely. That is, I think, sometimes thought of as a simpler and like more cost-effective way because it takes, I mean, the shell has to sit and cure for about 6 months before it is cleaned off of like food debris, and then we have volunteer handle it and bag it, and it takes us about a year to get the tonnage that we need to do a living shoreline. And while our living shorelines are impressive and they provide a lot of touch for individuals and it impacts people in terms of being able to have a relationship to the marsh, they're not miles long. So I think in terms of efficacy, people often think that like man-made recycling of man-made materials is better. And I've seen things where they've even like sunken parts of ships or like old barges or things. However, there is science that shows that oyster survivability is best on old oyster shell. And with rocks, you're not creating habitat and ecosystem in the same way. Oysters are a keystone species, so while they provide like structural changes, like the wave break and the reducing the erosion, they also become food. They attract different fish species and then in turn attract different bird species. And we're on a major migratory pathway as well. So having like the interplay of all these different species is critical for having like a truly sustainable coast.
Perfect. Thanks for that response. Ellen Hartig, hi. She asks, did I understand right that to keep costs down, maintenance and other dredging is still deposited offshore rather than kept for infill or build out of salt marsh?
My understanding is that to a large degree, yes, which is why we're trying to advocate for the beneficial use of dredged sediment. And I do believe that's because there's a law that's like you have, when it's a federal contract, you need to take like the most affordable option possible. And so the cheapest option for dredged sediment typically is just discarding it rather than having to like pump it or find a way to store it and then repurpose it into a restoration project.
So this is probably a good segue. This question is probably a good segue. Trevor McCauley asks, does your state's environmental agency collaborate with projects with CRCL? And, I think in my head, I'm thinking about the advocacy you do and, maybe even the policy work. So can you answer that question for Trevor?
I
Does the state's environmental agency collaborate with projects with CRCL? So I'm thinking, CPRA, and maybe even, I don't know if you guys work with DEQ or LDWF. There's a few different environmental agencies.
Yeah, we partnered LWF before.
We're losing you, Isabella. I don't know. You sound far away.
Hello?
I don't know what happened.
Is it better?
No, try now.
Hello?
Oh man, I don't know what's going on. We can hear you, but you sound distant.
Is
Just get
this better?
really close to the mic, I guess.
Yeah, sorry.
There
I'm
we
not
go.
sure why the
Yeah,
audio changed. So part like yes, but the scale of projects for these different agencies is pretty big. So CPRA and the projects that go into the master plan, they're interested in projects that have like a massive footprint. Any project that gets into the CPRA plan, they want to know that it's going to have a very sizable kind of ROI for cost and impact on the surrounding region. QIPRA, we were looking at 500 square miles, so and that's smaller than the footprint that they want the master plan projects to be. CRCL's projects, pretty small scale again, right? Like our Leeville Reef that we did was 50 feet, and that's I think maybe like a third. I think typically we'll permit around 200 feet for a reef, give and take, depending on the site. And then for our tree plantings, we have had a few. So right now, one that's ongoing is a series of plantings in the central wetlands within the greater New Orleans area. And so that's kind of a bigger region. That's also like a 4-year grant. So this is a project that we're working continuously on every planting season for 4 years to be able to have almost a more regional sized footprint. But because the scale is so different, we're not necessarily partnering to make one project happening. And that's kind of why the advocacy comes in, because the CPRA will pull funding and QIPRA has specific different funding pots too. And so CRCL can then go advocate as we do our own volunteer events and say, hey, we love having all of you guys out here with us today doing our very local planting. Did you know that there's this other project? And there's like a bill coming up for the passage of its funding. And like, if you vote yes for the project to be funded, it's more likely to happen. And so that's kind of how we're able to have the cyclical interworkings of the agencies.
perfect. Thanks, Isabella. Jane Rowan asks, have you been able to establish mangroves anywhere in your study areas? Are there any trees that have some tolerance for salinity?
I'll answer the first one first, which is like within the last year, we started looking at uh, survivability of mangroves, and I think we're noodling on trying to do a mangrove planting in the coming year. Um, it's a question of like how would we, I think right now, where would that site be and how would we source them? But there's research showing that yes, the temperatures are kind of shifting enough because it used to be that there was like one species that could kind of do well in our coastal zone, but because we still had a certain amount of like hard freeze, they didn't do great. Um, and because temperatures have been shifting, like that is shifting a little bit too. So we're exploring mangroves, but nothing has been put on the ground yet. And then are there trees that have some tolerance for salinity? Yes, but I think that gets into a different ecosystem type. So like a swamp is going to largely have like tupelo and cypress, and that's going to be freshwater. And then once you start getting into, and it also depends on the makeup, because if you have like a really big ridge that's kind of
Mhm.
sitting above the water line, then you can get like some oaks.
Mm-hmm.
And in Alabama, you have like all these savanna pine forests, but the pine forest ecology is like a slightly different ecology than the marsh system, but you will kind of see that more in the Southwest. That's a little bit further away from the delta. We talked a lot about the river's formation of the deltaic lobes, which is a little bit more the central and east part of
Mm-hmm.
the state, and then the southwest corner was built, call it the Chenier Plain, and we'll be doing like an oak tree planting this fall out there. Um, but it's a slightly different like systems, if that makes sense. Which is why probably also if you noticed on the native plantings map, it's like in the Southwest there are more kind of dune beach restorations and it's more of a firmer line. Whereas like over where the river is where we are, it's like very, very marshy. And so you kind of have the trees and the swamps and then you trickle down into the saltwater grasses.
Perfect. Yeah, I know my dad grew up in Grand Isle, which is, southwest, really far southwest Louisiana and or southeast, sorry, southeast Louisiana. And there's a ton of mangroves in Grand Isle. I don't
Yeah.
know if y'all were looking somewhere around that area, but um,
Think we were looking further inland, which is part of the trick, is because we'd want to do it like less of a barrier island thing and more of like a marsh project.
gotcha. Um, Thanks for that question, Jane. And then Don Silverberg, more for clarity. So thanks, Don, for bringing this up. Don says the channeled apple snail is invasive. There are actually native apple snails, particularly in Florida, that are primary prey items for the Everglade snail kite and the limpkin. So no question there, just a clarifying statement. Thanks, Don.
Yep.
And then Hunter Thompson asks, what projects have produced successful sedimentation of subsided marsh without using dredge material placement?
That's an excellent question, Hunter, and I think a longer answer than you might have thought. But diversions are one, because it really is all about like you wouldn't have to pump the sediment if the river was allowed to do its natural process of overflowing and outflowing its banks, and then during the process of like flooding, it loses momentum, and because the water's shallow, the sediment naturally outfalls. Um, and so the idea behind diversions is that you have like a controlled lock in the levee that goes down deep enough to where you can have the sediment that's suspended in the lower currents naturally filtering, trickling, and outfalling. So that's why there's so much conversation around it because it that would have like the mid-Barataria sediment diversion, which has been put on pause, but it would have been the single largest like restoration engineered project to have been built to date. But there were concerns about the size of it and the amount of flow of water that would be coming out of it. However, when the diversions are built, they're also built to be able to like control the flow, but there were a lot of politics
Mhm.
that were happening around that project, which is why it got paused. But also sometimes the river does this on its own. So Neptune Pass is a spot in the river where the flow kind of just got so strong it like pushed through the natural earthen levee that was in place and has created its own outflow area. And there's a lot of research. I think that was a year and a half ago or 2 years ago when it first made the river naturally first made this little cut. And there's a lot of research watching the accretion of sediment in that outflow area, which is like actively happening because that's just what the river is naturally want to do.
Mm, mhm. Okay, we have about a minute left. I know I have a couple questions left, but we do have some slides left over, so I don't want to have folks falling off whenever I'm going over those slides. I'm going to ask real quick this one of these questions. What are the hurdles to backfilling canals that have sliced the delta? And then we'll go ahead and end it.
I think
Last
in large
question.
part funding, that's a great question. I think it's also important to contextualize like the first canals that were being dug were for logging. So like there were not like the EPA didn't exist. There were not environmental protection laws. There was not like regulation on what companies were doing. And so we were clear cutting out our cypress swamps and hauling out those logs. And then over time, it became oil and gas canals. And at first, the oil and gas companies also kind of used the canals cut from logging. Um, at this point, though, I think it's cost and scale because why, there needs to be an incentive for the company to like want to do that if it's not a regulation and if it's just a cost, they're typically not very willing. And then scale being like once you've had a canal, I mean, I was just at a community meeting not like a month ago where members were saying that this shipping channel was dug and it needed to be dug at the time it was dug, but it was originally at like something very narrow, like 20 feet. Like it was shipping is the wrong word. It was like more of a just like a boat pass. It was very small. But then in just like 2 years, it's tripled in size and it's like 60 feet now. And so it's if you don't address it immediately, like very quickly, because of the amount of flow of water
Mhm.
that's being experienced by this region and the amount of like push that comes with storm surge, like truly when hurricanes come, that's when we see the most rapid rate of land loss. The football field every 100 minutes is like an hour, but scale really comes with storms. So when you get these strong pushes, even if the canal is very small, it like immediately widens. And then it's difficult to go back and fill that in. So it's best to kind of not do it and then to go back and remediate it. You're
As soon as it's
almost,
not used, essentially.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's like trying to fill in a pond sometimes at a certain
Well,
point.
well, much like a lot of things in Louisiana, it's complicated.
Yeah.
But I appreciate you so much, Isabella. Thanks so much for your time and the great discussion here. So we'll go ahead and close out with a few more slides, if that's okay. Please
Yeah.
send your any other questions you might have to Isabella. Her email address is there on the screen for you. Um, we're very proud to recognize our sponsors of the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series for 2025. That includes Davy Mitigation, SWCA, and RES. We greatly appreciate the support of our wonderful sponsors. You can find additional information on their websites listed above. Please visit, like, and follow our SWS webinar sponsors.